Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this Horizon 2020 webinar on how to avoid personal costs in Horizon 2020. I don't know if I am on.
You are.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So my name is Manuel Romaris. I'm training coordinator for Horizon 2020, and today I will guide you through the different aspects of this webinar. First, I would like to apologize because Peter Harwich, the head of unit of the Common Implementation Center, cannot be here today, so I will try to replace him. And I have for that actually two colleagues that are working in the Common Implementation Center and are taking care of the technical aspects. That's Olivier Margan, that you heard already, and Emmanuel Krollen is also taking care of the Slido part. And in addition, I have two other colleagues that I will introduce later that will do the presentations. Actually, we have two presentations, two very short presentations. These are about 20-minute presentations, one on the legal aspects and the other one on more audit aspects, is most common errors and how to avoid them. So we will go to these two presentations, 20 minutes each, 40 minutes in total, more or less, and after we will have the questions that will go through Slido. As you have seen in the web page, you have a code for slido.com, and the code is COSTS 2020. COSTS is with an S at the end, COSTS 2020, can be lower or uppercase, and it's all together. And please, before, you can also introduce questions from right now, but please, before introducing questions, have a look at the previous questions, and if there is a similar question, like it. So at the end, we will go through the different questions we have in the number, in order of number of likes. So if you have a similar questions, don't repeat it, just like the previous one. So out of the two presentations that we have today, the first one is the rules for declaring personal costs. And here we will have a look at the more legal aspects. We have for that with us Isabelle Leroy. Isabelle is a lawyer in the Common Implementation Center. Isabelle, the floor is yours.
So good morning, everyone. So I'm indeed Isabelle Leroy. I work in the Common Legal Support Service, where we provide legal support for the implementation of framework programs for research and innovation, and notably Horizon 2020. So this morning, I'm going to speak to you about the legal aspects of personal costs, and notably personal costs are important because they're usually a large part of grants under Horizon 2020. So it's important to know how to declare them and how to avoid errors in the declaration of personal costs. So today, in this perspective, we're going to focus on how to declare personal costs in the safest way. And I mean safest way in the sense that under Horizon 2020, we offer a rather large menu of options to declare personal costs. And to some extent, beneficiaries can choose among these options, but they need to grasp and understand fully under which conditions they need to fulfill to use one or the other options. And among these options, some are more complex, some are simpler. So we're going to focus and point you today towards the simpler options to declare personal costs. And now I will share with you my presentation. So can you see it?
Yes, it's very good.
Okay, do you see any boxes, or is there?
No, it's perfect like this.
Good. So first key message that I would like you to take with you today is that there are several framework programs and each one has its own rules. So today we're going to talk about Horizon 2020. So you see that there were successive framework programs for research and innovation. There was FP7 that started in 2007, Horizon 2020 in 2014, and now in 2021, it's a new program which is starting, which is Horizon Europe. However, you also see that there are overlaps between these periods. And so though this year Horizon Europe is starting, there are ongoing actions under Horizon 2020, which are ongoing and continuing for several years. And these actions under Horizon 2020 continue to be subject to the rules of Horizon 2020. So it's important to know that you are applying the Horizon 2020 rules. And I also would like to ensure you that what you are doing today by strengthening your or acquiring knowledge on Horizon 2020 is still very useful, because these our ongoing actions will continue for 1, 2, 3 years. And even after that, in the Horizon 2020, there can be audits on Horizon 2020 actions in 2025, 26, or even 27. So it's useful and very worth to have more information on Horizon 2020 at this stage. And under Horizon 2020, this morning, we're going to focus on the grants that reimburse actual costs, so that's real costs. And that's in opposition to grants that reimburse differently on the basis of lump sums or unit costs. For example, you have the Marie Sklodowska-Curie actions, which are based on unit costs. And we're not going to deal with them today because they are simpler at the stage of reporting personal costs, because they are based on fixed amounts. So they are less error prone than the variety that you can find under grants that reimburse real costs, actual costs. And also the grants that reimburse actual costs also are the vast majority under Horizon 2020. So now to the heart of the subject. What are personal costs? So basically, they're costs for the time that a person works on a Horizon 2020 action, and which cases can go under personal costs. So the first case is, of course, the case of employees. So persons who work under an employment contract with the beneficiary. The second case is a seconded staff. So that is staff which is seconded or contributed by another legal entity to a beneficiary. And this is quite often the case for public bodies or for universities in which staff is paid by the government, for example. Then the third big case, and maybe there are quite a few of you today, it's the case of small and medium-sized enterprise of which the owner is working on the action. So we will see later how the owner can declare the cost, notably if the owner does not receive a salary from the SME. And the fourth case is for the category of other persons working under other types of contracts, and that's notably the case of consultants. And here the question is to know whether they can fall under personal costs or if they may fall under another cost category. So we will have more details on these specific cases later on in the presentation. So here, about finding your way in personal costs, there's a lot of information on this slide, and I don't want to scare you with this slide. Here, the idea is to show you this vast menu of options that I mentioned earlier. So beneficiaries can to some extent choose among them, and some are more complex, but can also be useful to certain beneficiaries, notably experimented beneficiaries who understand the conditions to apply certain options. But here what we have identified and what you can see in blue-green are the simpler options to declare your personal costs. And so they form a simple path to declare your personal costs. Now, about the calculation of personal costs and where are the main aspects to avoid errors. So this is basically the formula to declare your personal costs. You can find it in your grant agreement under Article 6.2a. And so you multiply the number of hours worked on the action by an hourly rate. So for the hours worked on the action, you need time records. And for the hourly rate, you don't need to come up with a way to calculate it. The formula to determine your hourly rate is also displayed and laid down in your grant agreement in the Article 6.2a, and you have to apply this formula to calculate the hourly rate. Now I'm going to explain in more details the two elements of this formula. About the hours worked on the action. What we want to know and what you need to declare are the hours really worked on the project. So you cannot declare budgeted time. In this respect, budgeted time is what you can estimate at the beginning of the per action when you are making your budget, and there are often deviations between the time when you are making the budget and the time when we implement the action. And what we want to know at the time of reporting, and notably when you report personal costs, is the work that was really done, and so the hours that were really worked on the action. In the same line, you cannot declare estimated time, and you cannot either declare allocated time. And in this respect, you cannot declare a percentage of the time worked by a person, and you cannot use a percentage even if there is a percentage indicated in the work contract of the person. It sometimes happens that you have a contract indicating that a person will work a certain percentage on a project. And this is fine from the point of view of a contract, but of a work contract. But when it comes to reporting personal costs under Horizon 2020, we want the real number of hours. And so what you need to do is you need to have time records, and that's timesheets. So this is a general principle. The only exception when you don't need to use timesheets is when a person works exclusively on the action, and then this person, for this person, you can use a declaration of exclusive work on the action. But you have to be careful with the use of this declaration of exclusive work on the action, because you can only use one per reporting period, and the reporting periods are usually quite long, usually 18 months. And the declaration on exclusive work must cover an uninterrupted period. So if you have a worker that is not always working exclusively on the action, you cannot really use this declaration, and you must use timesheets. About what you use, what we want to see in timesheets, there are minimum requirements, and they are listed in a document which is called the Annotated Model Grant Agreement. I will refer to this document several times as it is a very useful document with the explanations on the articles of the grant agreement. So this document provides you the list of the minimum requirements that we want to see in timesheets, and that includes notably the number and name of the project, the identification of the beneficiary, the number of hours worked on the action, and a mention of the action task to which they were related, and of course the name, signature of the person working, and the signature name of the supervisor. And the timesheets must be signed at least monthly. So that's the most important information about timesheets, and about the part of the formula which concerns the hours worked on the action. Now, the other part of the formula is the hourly rate. So you see here, we have another formula to calculate the hourly rate. Again, this formula is displayed in your grant agreement under the Article 62A. So you have to calculate the hourly rate, you have to take the personal cost, the one recorded in your accounts, and you divide them by productive hours. So in more details about the numerator, the personal cost. So what can you include in the personal costs? You can include, obviously, salaries, as well as the social security contributions, so that's the mandatory employer and employee contributions, as well as taxes. And you can also include other costs included in remuneration, to the extent that they arise from a national labor law or collective labor agreement, or the work contract or the employment contract. That, for instance, could be a fee for a complementary health insurance, but you cannot include in these other costs things like an arbitrary bonus, and that would be a bonus that is not in line with the usual practice, remuneration practice of the beneficiary, or which is not based on objective conditions. Now, about the denominator, the productive hours. This is an area where you have options that among which you can choose. So I refer to the big tree of options that I showed you earlier. And here we're going to point you to the simpler option to declare personal costs, is to use as productive hours a fixed number per year. And we have fixed this number, so it's the same number for everyone. It's 1,720 hours. So this number does not change whether the person has overtime or has leave, sick leave, even long sick leave. The only exception is there is parental leave. And also, if the person is working part-time or has not worked the full year, then you can do a prorata of this fixed number, but otherwise it's the fixed number, 1,720 hours per year. Then the other two options, which we will not detail today for productive hours, are individual productive hours calculated at the level of each individual worker. And the other options are standard annual productive hours based on the standard practice of the beneficiary. Still about the hourly rate, we're going to see now how often you need to calculate it. So here there are two possibilities. And the one that we are putting forward as the simpler way to calculate your personal cost is to do the calculation of the hourly rate once per year. And here we mean once per full financial year. And it's your own financial year. So for each person, you need to do this for each person, a calculation of the personal cost divided by the productive hours for each person once a year. Now you see a little warning under the possibility of the calculation, an annual calculation, and that's for the situation when the reporting period ends in the middle of a financial year or during your financial year. For instance, if your next reporting period is ending in March 2022. So at that point, if your financial year runs from January to December, in March, you will not have the full figures for 2022. So in this case, you have to use the hourly rate that you calculated in the last closed financial year. And in my example of a reporting period ending in March 2022, it would mean that to calculate the personal costs for the month of January, February, and March 2022, you would apply the hourly rate that you calculated for 2021. Apart from that, this is the simpler option, notably because you only have to do the calculation once per year. Now, the other possibility of the frequency to calculate the hourly rate is monthly. So we think it's more complex and more error-prone, mostly because you have to do this calculation 12 times per year for each person. And they are more complex aspect also because when there is a part of the remuneration that is generated over a longer period than 1 month, you cannot simply add all the remuneration in the month where you pay it, but you have to calculate the entitlement per month and apply the pro rata per month. The rules also to calculate the hours, the productive hours, and how to declare personal costs when there is parental leave is more complex under calculation per month. So we recommend rather the calculation per year. Now, we have seen most of the elements concerning the calculation and the applications of the formulas to calculate personal costs. So you have made this multiplication of the hours worked by an hourly rate, and you obtain a result. And at this stage, still a check that you should do is to check that the result of your multiplication is not above 2 ceilings. So we call this the double ceiling rule. These ceilings are to ensure that you are not declaring more than what you incurred, and the ceilings are linked to the numbers that you used to calculate your hourly rate. So you cannot declare more hours as the hours that you worked on the action, that the number of productive hours that you used in the calculation of your hourly rate. And similarly, you cannot declare more costs, and there, I mean, you cannot claim more costs for reimbursement by the grant than the personal costs that are recorded in your accounts and that you use to calculate your hourly rate. And these 2 ceilings apply per person, per year, and for all EU and Euratom grants. And if you see that the result of your multiplication is above one of these ceilings, you simply use the ceiling as a capping and you don't declare above the ceiling. So now we've seen all the main elements and more areas where there may be errors to avoid. Still, I would like to point you to a tool that can help you further with the declaration of personal costs, and this is the Personal Cost Wizard. It's a tool which is integrated in the reporting module. So when you are submitting your financial statements at the end of your reporting period, what you can see on the screen is the entry point in the portal when you are reporting your personal costs. You have the wizard, which can help you for the calculation by applying the options of your choice, and also help you to check the double ceiling rule. And now I'm just going to mention to you 3 specific cases related to personal costs. The first one is the situation where a beneficiary would ask, I want to pay to my employee more than their normal salary for their work in this prestigious grant. So if the question does not ring a bell for you, it is presumably because you're not at all concerned by this specific case. This specific case is found very often in certain countries and is quasi inexistent in other countries. But for those who are concerned by this question, we would then answer, well, if you do this paying more only for the Horizon 2020 grant, we cannot accept it. And this is a principle that applies across the board. You must use to declare your cost under Horizon 2020 your usual accounting practices. So you cannot use calculate your cost in a very specific way just to declare the cost under Horizon 2020. But if you would answer to that you do this practice of paying more than normal for all prestigious grants, then indeed it exists in certain countries that you have this way of remunerating where it depends on the type of activity, and the employee will receive a different remuneration depending on the type of activity, and, for example, participation in a prestigious grant, but not only the Horizon 2020 grants. And then we would identify that this type of remuneration is called project-based remuneration. And here the beneficiary is having this little scared emoji because indeed it is one of the complex cases in the declaration of personal costs. And there we really advise you to look into the annotated model grant agreement to see how to declare personal costs when you have project-based remuneration. And we cannot cover it today because there's too many details to explain. Now I'm switching to another specific case, which is much simpler. And this is the case when the owner of a small and medium-sized enterprise does not get a salary from the SME. First of all, I just want to clarify that if the owner of an SME does receive a salary, then it's not a specific case, it just falls in the calculation that we have seen at the beginning of the presentation. But if the owner does not receive a salary, then to declare personal costs, you must use a unit cost, which we have fixed, and there is also country coefficient corrections depending on the country where the SME is established. The calculation and is automatic in the reporting system, so it's very simple. And an owner of an SME that does not receive a salary has to use this unit cost, even if it is compensated by other means such as dividends or service contract. Then you cannot use another way to declare personal cost than this unit cost for the SME owner without a salary. And then the third specific case that I wanted to mention this morning is the case of consultants. So a person who is not an employee, not working under an employment contract, under another type of contract. And we have seen that there has been a multiplication of other types of contract that we call also quasi-subordinate contracts. And there the question is to know whether they can fall under personal costs. If they do, they would be under a specific category, which is in the Article 62A2 of your grant, which is for direct contracts between a natural person and a beneficiary. There are several conditions for the costs of a consultant to fall under this category of personal costs. And one of the main conditions is that you need to have a direct contract between the natural person and the beneficiary. So if there is an intermediary, such as a temporary work agency, it cannot fall under this category and it cannot fall under personal costs. Another of the main conditions to be under this category of personal costs is that the consultant must work under conditions which are similar to those of employees, notably in their organization of the work, in tasks, the right to telework, and also in terms of remuneration, having a similar level of remuneration, and also having remuneration which is based on working time rather than delivering output. So if your consultants fulfills these conditions, it can fall under and be declared, the cost can be declared under personal costs. If the consultant does not fulfill the conditions, then it does not mean that you cannot declare costs for these consultants. It means that the costs may fall under other categories of costs, notably contracts or possibly subcontracts. But these categories of costs have their own eligibility conditions, and notably that the contracts must be awarded in a manner ensuring best value for money and without conflict of interest. So now we have covered all the points that I wanted to mention. I will just point you to further sources for further information. So firstly, there is the Annotated Model Grant Agreement, which I mentioned several times. So it is a very helpful document with explanations and lots of details, but also lots of explanations. It's presumably you can find there the answers to nearly all your questions. It's organized by articles, and you could also use the search function to, if you're interested in a specific word, that's a way to find explanations on a specific aspect. If you want to have information on more technical or practical aspect of the grant management, then you have the online manual. And if you didn't find answers in these two documents, you can submit your questions to two places. First of all, the network of national contact points. So these are people in your country who know your legislative framework, who speak your language, but who are also experts in Horizon 2020. And we meet with them regularly to exchange and keep updated. And the other way to submit a question, if you have one, is the Research Inquiry Service, which under which your questions will be sent to the Commission and answered by colleagues in the Commission. And now I thank you for your attention, and I give the floor back to Manuel.
Thank you very much, Isabel. Actually, I would like to say that at the beginning of this page where you are watching this webinar, there are plenty of links actually to the different documents, including the Annotated Grant Agreement. So we are already receiving plenty of questions for you, Isabel, but we will deal with them at the very end. So if you can wait a little bit, we have now Sorin Serban, who will introduce us with the most common errors and how to avoid them. Good morning, Sorin. Sorin is an auditor in the Common Implementation Center.
Good morning, Manuel. Good morning, everybody. I'm trying to share my screen. Can you see the presentation?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you very much. So, good morning. As Manuel was saying, I'm working in the Common Audit Service. I'm an auditor, financial auditor, and we are dealing with to carry on the audits for Horizon 2020 grants. Basically, this presentation would be about how do we check and what advices we can give you in order to avoid errors in financial audits. First of all, just a big small general presentation about errors. Why do they occur in general? Of course, the first main justification is because of misunderstanding of the rules, and I think the previous presentation of my colleague Isabel tried to help in that respect. And the second is about lack of attention to details, to the detail of the provisions of the grant agreement. Sometimes the provisions in the grant agreement are very specific or very clear, and you have to see and to look for these details. and eventually also, of course, intentionality. Now, about the consequence of errors, for beneficiaries, the first main consequence is the fact that the available funding is not used optimally. And okay, this is obviously adverse to the beneficiaries, and this may also, some of the errors may also lead to recoveries, so to recuperate, of course, the money paid to beneficiaries. For the European Commission institutions and services, the errors could bring scrutiny of the budgetary authority and the European Court of Auditors. This could increase the error rate, because there is a calculation of an overall error rate as well for the program Horizon 2020, and increase, of course, the exposed audit efforts. And of course, an impact on the corrective measures that could be taken in order to decrease the error rates. So overall, the error rate calculation is done as follows. From the population of paid financial statements, we are drawing a sample, random sample, and from that sample, we will calculate an error rate, which is basically, to make it in a simple way, the sum of negative adjustments divided by the sum of audited adjustments, amounts, sorry, from the actions. The purpose, one of the purposes as well of the audit reports is to assess the legality and regularity of Horizon 2020 project payments, and to calculate also a so-called residual error rate that should be kept at an acceptable level, meaning that the error rate remains in other non-audited grants. The general control objective is to get the residual error rate as close as possible to 2%, without necessarily expecting it to be to get under 2%. Now, the main detected errors that we see in financial audits in Horizon 2020 linked to personnel costs are due mainly to incorrect productive hours calculation. So I will come to the later on to a next slide. We'll take this one by one, but basically the main type of errors are the productive hours, which are incorrectly calculated, the remuneration cost, for example, estimated, but other reasons as well, but, which has to deal with the upper part of the calculation. I will speak about it in the next slide. The incorrect time working on the action claim. So this has to do with the first part of the equation of the calculation of personnel cost, and other, of course, for example, and especially unreliable or missing timesheets to calculate the number of hours worked on the action. I was saying about the formula to calculate personnel cost, which my colleague Isabel already explained, I think, quite in detail, but going through this, I think we can easily see what kind of errors we detect in the calculation of personnel cost. So first of all, the hours worked is the first part, the numerator is the total personnel cost, and the denominator, the productive hours, option 1, 2, 3. The second part of the equation is the so-called hourly rate. The first part is the hours worked. So if we look first of all at the time recording, meaning the first part of the equation, the number of hours worked on the action, the main errors that we see, or sources of errors, let's put it this way, are, for example, the inconsistency with the HR records. And here, I think we should mention that in general, the hours declared should be in accordance with the HR, meaning, for example, the absences, the holidays, the bank holidays, or other data that we have in the HR records. For example, termination of a contract or recruitment of a new person should, of course, be consistent with the information in the time recording system, and further also to the information declared in the financial statements. The timesheets, time recording should contain, of course, properly dated and signed timesheets. This is part of the minimum conditions, of course, and it has to do with the appropriateness and sufficiency of the audit evidence. The hours should not be in excess of the full-time equivalent. This has to do with the so-called double C explained earlier by my colleague. obviously, if the number of hours to be worked, if you use option 1, for example, and you declare more than 1,720 hours, then you will have there is an error to be corrected. Also, if you declare personal cost, an amount of personal cost for a person, and then in the accounting you have a lower amount for the personal cost of that person, then we also are breaching double ceiling, the so-called double ceiling in the rules, and then we also have another error. And then, of course, the sufficiency in terms of information of the evidence, which should be verifiable, auditable, and available. The sufficiency has to do with the quantity of evidence available. So the grant agreement is very specific in that regard about the quantity of evidence that you should keep in case of an audit or inspection or other type of reviews of checks in general. But also about the appropriateness of this evidence, which has to do with the quality of the evidence, meaning it should be relevant for the objectives of the checks and for the overall objective of the rules established in the grant agreement. Now, the numerator, when we talk about the first part of the equation, the number of hours, the time body system that provides this number of hours worked for the action. And then the second part is the numerator of the calculation of the hourly rate, meaning the personal cost, individual or per category. We'll not enter into the details depending on the type of calculation, but the personal cost calculated and how to avoid errors here. So first of all, I would like to clarify that the personal cost here, the hourly rate could be calculated per person or in average. So of course, if you have an hourly rate, individual hourly rate, then the personal cost above would be for each person separately. And if you have average personal cost, then the personal cost refers to a category of cost. Yeah, your cost center, for example, a department, etc. So the personal cost here, in order to avoid having errors, personal cost should include the salaries, so-called brute salaries or gross salaries, the social security contributions, so the employers and employees' social security contributions. Of course, the employers' social security contributions are normally included in the gross salaries or brute salaries. So please don't declare them twice. They are already there. And also other taxes and costs included in the remuneration. But of course, please pay attention here. If they arise from national law or employment contracts, there are some conditions. And as soon as you go with some additional costs to declare, we strongly advise you to have a look in the annotated grant agreement and to check whether these costs are eligible or are to be considered eligible. As a best practice, please do not include any ineligible item. So items that are in Article 6.5 of the grant agreement, basically entertainment cost or other type of costs that are considered ineligible, not linked to the action and so on, or any other costs that are already declared, included in other budget cost categories, for example, indirect cost or other type of cost, travel cost, equipment, etc. Obviously, for avoiding double funding, yeah, declaring the same cost twice. So that's about the upper part of the calculation of the hourly rate. Now, regarding the part which is under about the denominator, of course, we come back to the three options to calculate productive hours. Here, the option 1 is obviously a strong advice to go through because it is applicable in all situations, and you must also use this option if the employment contract does not specify working time conditions or if the annual workable hours cannot be determined. So the second option, you must use the formula. Please pay attention to the overtime that should be declared as well, in order to take it into account, in order to avoid, of course, once again, double funding. And also to double check the conditions in the annotated grant agreement, especially linked to the consistency, to the fact that it should be applied consistently. The same condition applies also to option 3. They should be applied consistently. This should be also according to beneficiaries' usual cost accounting practices, and we must respect the threshold of 90% of the standard annual workable hours. So the workable hours do not include the so-called non-productive hours, and these are very well explained in the annotated grant agreement. But the advice obviously would be to go for option 1, which is easier in practice to apply. Now, some additional hints how to avoid errors. You can make sure that the time charged to the project is correct. Now, this time comes from the timesheets, time recording system. You have an electronic one, and the number of hours declared on the project. You should ensure that the number of hours declared on the project are the same as the number of hours worked for the project as registered in the timesheet. So basically, the timesheets coincide and are the same. The number of hours in timesheets is the same as the number of hours declared for the calculation of the personnel cost, as explained earlier. The time records meet the grant agreement conditions. Now, there are 6 minimum conditions, and please pay attention to them because this has to do with sufficiency of the evidence, of the audit evidence, and they are required according to the grant agreement. I'm not entering into the 6 conditions, but okay, they are basically the number of hours worked on the action, the beneficiary's name, full name, supervisor, full name and signature, employee working for the action, full name and signature, and date, and so on. And then another advice is to check that the remuneration in the numerator is correct. Yeah, meaning that, for example, we don't have ineligible cost, as explained earlier, or that any specificities, if you go to add additional cost, are really double checked against the very useful guidelines in the annotated grant agreement. Okay, bonuses as well, for example, are really not arbitrary, and the last financial year is applied, and things like that. And of course, for the denominator, the productive hours in the denominator are correct, depending on the options used. Also, pay attention if you use monthly calculation, not to use option 2. This is also very well explained in the grant agreement to avoid errors. Now, personal cost formula reconciles, of course. If you calculate the personal cost by the number of hours multiplied by the hourly rate, of course, you should also check arithmetical accuracy before submitting a financial statement. It still happens. There may be multiple reasons why, but you still find errors of reconciliation, of wrong calculation for different reasons. So that's really very useful to have in mind. Also to double check the transaction listing reconciles. So when you make an extraction from the accounting system, to ensure that what you declare is really in accordance with the transaction listing that you have. Basically, that the cost you declare are really incurred by you in the accounting. The employment contracts are in place for those employees that have an employment contract. If there is no employment contract, then you have to further look in the annotated grant agreement to have to see how this personal cost should be declared, either as, for example, SME owners with Marie Curie rates, Paris Local Curie rates, or natural persons with direct contract, and so on. So as soon as you don't have an employment contract, then you should really pay attention and further look how to declare the cost in the financial statement. For the exchange rate, also, this is especially for beneficiaries that have accounting which are not reported in euro. Please pay attention because there is an exchange rate stipulated by the annotated by the grant agreement. Yeah, to be followed. And then, of course, the final test is to perform all these checks before you submit your financial statement to the European Commission services. Thank you for your attention and participation. Besides the reference documents that the colleagues already put forward, and that they are also listed in the site, I think you can also further go to the audit program, which is published for Horizon 2020, which you can use as well in case you would like to double check or to check yourself if your system and for Horizon 2020, in case of an audit, for example, to do these checks. This is published, or you can also use it to see what an auditor would check in case of an audit. Thank you very much. Back to you, Manuel.
Thank you very much, Sorin. I just want to remind everybody that you can still ask questions and like the questions that are already asked there or written in Slido. We have all the presentations at the very beginning of this web page, the event web page. So you can see there the presentations, download them, and also there will be the recording after this event. There will be the recording. So if you can watch again Isabel and Sorin over and over again, you are welcome to do so. If you have any questions, you know that you have also the research inquiry service afterwards. But now we are going to go directly to the questions. And I'm waiting for Olivier and Manuel to put the Slido session at the bottom of this webpage, so we can go directly to these questions. And I have to say that we have a new colleague joining for the answering the question. That's Miriam Gomez Martelo. She's a lawyer. She's head of sector in the Common Implementation Center. Thank you very much, Miriam, for being here and helping us with the questions. So I'm going to start already reading the questions while they appear here in Slido. They don't appear for me now, Olivier or Emmanuel. I don't know if they appear for everybody. But in any case, I have the Slido session open. And the first question I have is the typical question about the timesheet. Actually, timesheet is giving a lot of problems to everybody. So could you explain the new timesheet format? And who wants to answer that? Isabel?
Yes, I can start. So I'm not sure about this question for a new timesheet format. The timesheet format changed in the middle of the program. That was several years ago. And actually, when I'm talking about a format, there isn't a compulsory format. The only requirement is that your time recording system complies with the minimum requirements which are listed in the annotated model grant agreement. However, what we propose also in the annotated grant agreement is a model a template that you can use, but that is optional. If, for instance, you don't have your own recording system or it doesn't fulfill the minimum requirements, we have this template that is accessible via a link in the annotated model grant agreement under Article 18 on keeping records. And of course, this template, if you follow this template, it fulfills the minimum requirements for time recording.
Perfect. Thank you very much. We seem to have a small technical problem. We cannot see the Slido on the event webpage. Olivier and Manuel are working on that, but we continue actually with the page on Slido directly, slido.com. I want to remind you that the code actually to ask questions is costs with an S at the end, 2020. So next question, we have 30 likes here. It is possible to declare time work on weekends in the timesheet. As you know, many people are working on long experiments over the weekend, or that depends on the organization internal rules. That's also you, Isabel?
So you need to declare all hours worked on the project. However, the big caveat here is that you can only declare costs which are in line with national legislation on working time and the collective labor agreement and the employment contract. So it's in this limit that you can declare time worked on the action.
Thank you. Next question. What if we end up working more hours than planned in some of the tasks?
So this is often the case, that there are deviations between what was estimated at the time of making the budget and what happened in the implementation of the project. At the time of reporting, it's actually more in the reporting of the resources and the effort in person month that you would explain the deviations compared to what was estimated at the beginning. And this is to be discussed with the project officer. To some extent, the deviations are acceptable when they are justified. The only limit to that is that there is the question also of the budget. This can entail transfers in the budget. When it's transfers, most of the transfers can be done without an amendment, as long as you are not changing the description of the tasks which are in the Annex 1 of your grant agreement. And also the ultimate limit to such changes is that the maximum grant amount which is indicated in your grant agreement cannot be increased.
Thank you very much. Actually, apparently the problem I have that I cannot see the slide of session is that because my cookies are disabled. So apparently it's only my problem. But in any case, if you have the same problem, please know that you have to admit the cookies in your browser. So next question is Benjamin Sierra Navarro. Thank you, Benjamin, for putting your name. It's always nice to have a name behind. Our salaries include retribution in kind, such as medical insurance, transport, etc. Can these concepts be considered as part of the personal costs?
So I can start, but then maybe Sorin will want to complete the answer. So we indicated that in the personal cost that you can use to calculate the hourly rate, you can put, of course, the salaries, but also other items of the remuneration if they arise from the national legislation or collective labor agreement or the employment contract. So this can be, for instance, medical insurance, and for other aspects, you have to also ensure that they comply with your usual cost accounting practices and that they are registered in your accounts as personal costs. I don't know if Sorin, you want to add something on this.
Thank you, Isabel. No, I mean, you explained it very well for especially for other so-called in-kind remuneration. You should really see whether this is remuneration, first of all, and this is really foreseen by the applicable employment contract, national law, or labor agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, Sorin. Thank you, Isabel. And the next one is probably for you, Isabel. In Horizon 2020, we have to declare hours rounded up. How can we do simultaneously to declare all of our hours in the given year?
So today we're not going to focus too much on Horizon Europe, but indeed there is a change in the way of reporting costs, which will be based on a daily rate. If you have a time recording system and that you record your hours and you will continue to use your time recording system independently of the projects on which you are working, you can use these hours to declare your personal cost under Horizon 2020, and there will be ways, and there are ways to convert the hours into days for Horizon Europe. Actually, if you're interested in further information, there's already available on the portal under the Horizon Europe section, a pre-draft of annotations on the Horizon Europe Model Grant Agreement, where these conversion rules of hours into days are explained.
Thank you. Next one, I think, is also for you regarding the annual rate calculation. In the case of a new employee, how do we calculate the hourly rate based on the last financial year?
So this question is absolutely spot on, because this is a specific case. And indeed, if you recruited a new employee in the ongoing financial year, you don't have any figures for this employee in the last closed financial year. So this is an exception to the last closed financial year. And for these employees, you use the figures of the ongoing financial year.
And how do we calculate the person months?
Well, person months, I first need to explain that the notion of person months does not belong to the reporting of personal costs. This notion of person months, you only use it in the reporting when you are explaining the resources that you used for the action tasks, but it's not at all included in the calculation of personal costs. And as for calculating person months, this is not defined by us. We have not fixed any rules on how to determine person months. It's up to your own way of calculating person months.
Thank you. Next question is from Julia Ferrando. If the bonus is included in their contract, is it valid? That's probably for you also, Isabel.
I think that with such question, we don't have enough information to know if a bonus is eligible. As I indicated in the presentation, anything that's like an arbitrary bonus will not be eligible. So the main aspect is that it is considered as arbitrary if it does not follow the usual accounting practices of the beneficiary, and also if it's not based on objective conditions. So it's not any bonus that can be considered as eligible. But if the bonus arises from the work contract and is objective, and then we have to see if it can be eligible, and then you have to see if it falls in what we call basic remuneration, and that's the way to calculate personal costs that I explained in the presentation, or whether it's the type of project-based remuneration, which is the specific case that I mentioned at the end, where there is a different level of remuneration for different type of activity, and there it's another way of calculating, but it may still be valid. The only thing that I can specify at this point, if it's project-based remuneration, is that anything that would fall under additional remuneration in this framework is only eligible for non-profit entities and up to a ceiling of 8,000 euros per year per person.
We have another question about timesheets. What if our company does not record time hours?
So here the very strong message is that the number of hours that you're going to declare must be supported by reliable records. And if they are not, then the personal costs are not eligible. So if you don't have your own system, we can advise you to simply look for the template that is available in the Annotated Model Grant Agreement. It's a very short and simple template, so it's useful in particular for those who don't have a time recording system.
Thank you, that's clear enough. So I have two questions here that are floating with 116 likes now. What about digital time recording, since we have already talked about that? Isabel.
So you can have an electronic time recording system, and there are conditions that the system must fulfill, and actually they are detailed in the Annotated Model Grant Agreement under Article 18. But if I remember well, they are mainly that you need to have electronic identity of the person and linked to with a secured manner, and secured with manager rights which are secured, and an auditable log. And so I think that's about the three conditions that the electronic system must comply with. But for further information, if you want to be sure, it's in the Annotated Model Grant Agreement. I'm just checking if I don't have the information here. So yes, the signature is electronic, and it must be linked to the electronic identity with a password. And must be linked to electronic validation data with secure process and an auditable log there. Voila.
Perfect, thank you. So next question is, when do they have to ask for a CFS audit? When they reach the 325,000 ceiling or at the end of the project?
So this is a question which is outside personal costs. It's about reporting, and it concerns all the costs. So that it's so you have to reach the threshold. That's when your requested contribution for certain costs is above this ceiling of 325,000 euros. But for the time when you submit the CFS, this is always with the final report. And actually doesn't prevent you from making for example, two CFS if you want to make one for the first part and one for the second part, but you can only submit the CFS and also submit costs to have the CFS in the final report, not in an intermediary reporting period, because then the cost would not be accepted.
Thank you. And there is another one about personal costs here. Is the first day of the month is a Sunday. Do you consider a whole month of personal costs or not?
I don't think it has any incidence. We're going to calculate the number of hours that you work during the month, and perhaps you will be in the case of a monthly hourly rate, and you will calculate your number of productive hours for the month. So for me, maybe I don't get the question, but they wouldn't have an impact.
Thank you. In order to calculate the hourly rate, do we use the remuneration of the previous year or of the current year?
So there we are talking about a calculation of the hourly rate per year. So you use the hourly rate of the full financial year. So when you have the figures of the full financial year, for example, when you will have them, you have them now for 2020. So when you are reporting costs for work done in 2020, you can now use the full financial year of 2020 because you have all the information for 2020. If you have to report in 2021, let's say in October 2021, if your financial year runs from January to December, you are in a situation where you don't have the full figures for 2021. So in this case, for the months of 2021 for which you need to report, you would use the figures of 2020, and so the hourly rate that you calculated for 2020.
And the next question, it's a very specific case about maternity leave. The costs during maternity leave are first booked in the project and paid later by the health insurance. First, they declare actually and adjust them in the next period. Is that okay?
So I will first explain about what you can do for parental leave. So if you are calculating your hourly rate per year, you can deduct the time spent on parental leave from the productive hours that you use to calculate the hourly rate. And about for example, salaries or contributions that the beneficiary may have paid during their parental, so here, maternity leave, you can include it in the costs if this compulsory to pay these salaries and contributions according to national law or collective labor agreement, and only also if the cost is really incurred by the beneficiary and is not later reimbursed to the beneficiary. So then if it's the later reimbursed beneficiary, it's not an eligible cost. And if you have declared it, whereas it's not an eligible cost, indeed, you have the possibility to correct this as an adjustment that you do in the next reporting period.
Thank you. I just want to remind everybody that we have reached 1 hour of webinar and we intended to stay until noon, until 12, answering questions for you, provided there are questions, of course. And the next one. Will the use of the personal cost wizard become compulsory?
I'm perhaps not the best person to know about that. I don't know if colleagues from HV know more. Not to my knowledge, no. It's a tool that's helping and it's available for if you want to use it, but I'm not aware that it would become compulsory.
Perfect, thank you. PM cost divides the annual cost by 11 and monthly cost divides by 12. This creates confusion. Should we use PM or monthly cost for proposal budget calculation?
So I'm not sure that I fully understand the question. I guess this is part of your practice of this beneficiary to calculate person months. At the budget stage, indeed, you're going to use some person month, but you will have to put amounts in the personal costs in your budget. I'm not sure how to answer. The only thing I can say is that what you put in the budget is an estimation and it doesn't have to be fixed. Then you still have the possibility, as I explained, to some extent to have deviations or transfers if it does not correspond exactly to what you budgeted.
If I may add, Isabel.
Yes, of course.
As a best practice from an audit perspective, I think it's useful to use your usual practice, or if you don't have one, once you can use one of the options foreseen in the grant agreement. I'm saying this in the sense that a project, so to calculate the project amount cost, you will divide a personal cost in the numerator by a denominator. The denominator could be the standard productive hours, or one of the options to calculate productive hours, and the numerator, of course, the personal cost of that person. Now, of course, when we talk about 11 or 12, the productive hours in general do not include holidays. Yeah. So, of course, normally it's 11. So, as a best practice, you may calculate consistently the cost either for the budgeting purposes in person months, or for the calculation of the reporting at the end, by using more or less the same calculation of hourly rate. Here, it's just that the granularity of the calculation is not hourly rate, it's monthly rate. So it's more or less the same, but please ensure consistency between both. Thank you.
Thank you, Sorin. Here we have another question that is, I'm not sure is really related to this webinar. How do you manage extensions in a project? Isabel, do you want to take it? Because that's a legal question.
Yes, this concerns, so I guess this would be a request to modify the duration of the action, and this requires an amendment. You have to make a request for an amendment and see if it's obtained. I guess it would have to need justifications for the amendment to ask for an extension of the duration.
Thank you. We have a colleague in maternity leave the whole year 2021, which will be her annual rate or for financial reports in 2022?
Actually, so this is the problem comes from if the reporting periods end in 2022, you don't have the full numbers for 2022, and so which rate are going to apply? There was nothing in 2021. I have a doubt. Maybe it's considered as a new employee. But maybe Sorin, do you know if you go back to 2020 or if it's a new employee in 2022?
I didn't saw this situation in practice. Most probably, even if there is no available data for the last for the year 2021, most probably you will have available data for the year before 2020. For example, the idea is to have obviously a full closed financial year in order to calculate the hourly rate. So maybe the best practice would be to use the previous year. Okay.
Thank you. And can the PI sign all the timesheets, including his or her?
So the timesheet needs to be signed by a supervisor as well as the person who is working. It's only in very specific cases where it's a one-person company and there's absolutely no supervisor that maybe the same person, there's only the signature of the person working, but a PI just like that, without knowing the context, we cannot say yes.
Okay. Can we declare a trainee?
Well, first of all, you have to only declare personal cost in compliance with national law. And when it comes to students or PhD, etc., the conditions to declare personal cost are, first of all, that their contract, because they need a contract, is work-oriented and not training-oriented. And then you also need to ensure that the allocation of task is in compliance with the legislation or collective labor agreement, that you fact that you're assigning a task to a student, and also make sure that the trainee has the skills to perform the task.
Thank you. A financial report of less than 325,000 euros. Does it have to be certified by external auditors, or the F-sign signature is enough?
I think this question seems to be related to this certificate on the financial statements, because I see this threshold of 325,000 euros. So actually, the threshold does not concern the financial report per se, but the amount of requested contribution for certain costs. And then you have to provide, in addition to your financial report and your financial statement, a certificate on the financial statement, which is indeed has to be done by an external auditor.
Thank you again. So, can you give details on how a paid leave or a sick leave do not change the productive hours?
So I see that the question also mentions that it would be in the option for productive hours, which is the fixed number 1,720 hours. And here it's very simple in terms of productive hours, is that you don't deduct any hours for paid leave or sick leave.
Thank you. I have another question here, two questions that are floating up and down. What happens if the personal month rate you gave in the proposal submission differs from the actual PM rate when it comes to do the financial report?
Maybe I can try to go ahead here. Okay, so from a point of view, from another point of view, in the financial statement submitted, not in the proposal, the basic rule is that you should submit at the end the actual cost. So, of course, you should not submit the person month. You will submit the number of hours and the real cost, calculated the hourly rate. So you will not submit an actual PM for us, in our view. If you calculate it through a PM, a cost of a person month, that's according to your usual practices. But what we do expect is that calculation of the personal cost follows one of the possibilities explained earlier in the presentations, either through actual average and then using productive hours and so on. So what we really look at from another perspective is that the actual number of hours and actual hourly rate is correct. Thank you.
Thank you, sorry. We have a slight problem actually with your sound. If you could next time approach the micro a little bit more, because sometimes we lose you somehow.
Yes,
so,
of course. Thank you.
Next question. What does properly dated and signed mean? Which time frame is accepted for the signature of the timesheet?
So the timesheet should be signed at least monthly by the person working and the supervisor. So the time frame is within the month.
And here we have a question about one of the presentations. What are the specific rules to pay more than the normal salary? Slide 11 of some of you.
So this is about the project-based remuneration. If we try to explain it in a nutshell, somebody who identifies that they have a way of remunerating where they have a remuneration which is specific when the person works on specific activities, notably, for example, for participation in certain grants, but not only Horizon 2020 grants. The person will be, the beneficiary will have its remuneration under project-based remuneration, and they have to identify if part of their remuneration is called additional remuneration. So for this, they would have to calculate two rates. They would have to calculate a rate for the action, and they're going to use the personal cost they're paying for this specific activity for which they're paying more, divided by the hours spent on this activity for which they're paying more, and this gives them an action rate, and they have to compare it with what they would pay if the person was working on a project funded by a national scheme. And there are several references to see how you calculate this rate for a project funded by national scheme. Notably, it can arise from regulatory requirements or from internal rules, and that there is nothing of these references. You can use the average of the remuneration of the person in the last year. And then you have this, we call it reference rate for the national funded projects. And then you compare the action rate that you calculated for this specific activity for which you may want to pay more with the rate that you calculated for a project funded by a national scheme. And if you have more, if the action rate is superior, is more than the reference rate for national scheme, this part is additional remuneration. And then this part does not enter into the calculation that we've explained of an hourly rate and the personal cost by this multiplication. It can come on top if the beneficiary is a non-profit entity and in the limit of 8,000 euros per person per year.
Thank you. Can you adjust the timesheet if you declare in the wrong word package? My colleagues declare.
Maybe it's because the timesheet, you will not provide it with your submission of your reports and financial statements. This is part of the documents that you must keep, notably in case of an audit. I'm not sure if Sorine, there's a good way to make a correction in a timesheet.
What I can say is that so it depends also on the type of timesheet you use. If you have a time recording system, electronic one, of course you may have it should be registered in the logs and so on, and you should have the possibility to do that and document it properly. Yeah, the reasoning why you're changing backwards, because I imagine it's backwards a timesheet. So this is for the time record, for the electronic one. For the paper timesheets, of course you can do it if you realize there is an error, but to document it properly, the better way or the best practice would be to explain what happens and ensure that the correction is really to ensure reliability of the time recording system. Thank you.
Thank you, Sorin. Does the GDPR law have any impact on declaring personal salary? Is an approval for an employer required?
Well, I'm not sure that I will be able to answer this question. We are declaring personal costs in the financial statement. It's a global amount for the whole personal costs of the beneficiary. And then when it comes to checks that may be done at the time of an audit, then you would the auditors would see personal data. I mean, in the pay slips, etc. But they're working under strict compliance with the regulation on data protection.
And what happens if you end up below the amount of budget, meaning cost equal hours per hourly rate received from the EU?
So you declare all the costs which are eligible. And so if the result of your calculation is less than you had budgeted, you declare the real cost, so the costs which are really eligible, the time really worked on the action, and so the cost resulting from that. Which means that you will receive less than budgeted. Then if you are in a consortium, in a multi-beneficiary grant, possibly the remaining budget can be transferred to another beneficiary, for instance.
Thank you. Is it necessary to fill in timesheets for personnel that is employee full-time?
So the only exception to the use of timesheets is not only that the person is employed full-time, but that it works exclusively on the Horizon 2020 action. So that's really, really the difference.
If I may add here, so in terms of evidence, what you should keep in mind is that if a person has, so there are two possibilities: either you use timesheets, including for those that work full-time, or you use a declaration for exclusive work. So the answer is yes, you should use timesheets even if the person works full-time, or declaration for exclusive work. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
And we may add that this use of the declaration on exclusive work, of course, it's not an obligation. It's a choice, but you can only use it if it's exclusive work, and you really have to be careful that the person does not have any other activity, and other activities are quickly taken into account to consider that you're not working exclusively on the action. So the safest way, if we are talking this morning about avoiding errors, is timesheets.
Thank you both. Next question, can we declare our subsidiaries' hours or costs? Subsidiary personnel is not directly working for us, but charging via invoice.
So here we are in a case where it's possibly a third party. So if we're talking about another legal entity than the beneficiary, another legal entity will be a third party to the model grant agreement. And in this respect, cannot just charge costs, and the beneficiary cannot just charge costs for staff in its subsidiary working on the Horizon 2020 action. So then you have to consider how this third party may be involved in the action, and if this charging is done by invoice, well, yeah, you have to see, for example, if it's linked to the beneficiary, it may be linked third party, and then when you have this status, but you have to do that in the preparation of your proposal and during the grant preparation, then an a linked third party can declare its own costs. So there the subsidiary will be declaring its own costs. And the only thing that makes me think that's maybe another type of third party is also that it may be just providing staff, and in this way seconding staff to the beneficiary. So this could be possibly also considered as in-kind contribution of staff to the beneficiary. In this case, this would have to be indicated in the Annex 1 of the grant agreement, and this is a condition for the cost to be eligible. And then maybe it could be also another type of third party, like subcontracting, if the subsidiaries carry out action tasks, but maybe this not the most well-fitted option in this case, because when you are using subcontracts, you have to ensure that the subcontract is awarding in a manner ensuring best value for money. And usually this is not appropriate for entities which are affiliated, and they rather fall as an exception for subcontracts.
Thank you, Isabel. The work of an accounting department who is working actually on calculating personnel costs, is that considered indirect cost or personal costs?
So usually administrative staff and the work that they do is usually considered as falling under indirect costs. And it's only if it's the usual accounting practice of the beneficiary to register these costs as personal costs, and that the costs fulfill the eligibility conditions for personal costs, that they could be considered as direct personal costs.
Thank you. We have a question now from Xavier. We have seconded researchers, but we only compensate the giving entity a fraction of their cost. How to report this? Part for free and part against payment?
So I understand it's from the point of view of beneficiary. I would say that as long as there is a sort of financial transaction with a third party which is provided their staff, it would fall under in-kind contribution against payment. And then you have to declare this is a specific cost category for the seconded staff under Article 62A3. And you have to make sure that your in-kind contribution is indicated in the Annex 1 of the grant agreement.
Perfect, thank you very much. How does a partner report personal costs from a third party, major established company in this case, providing co-funding?
So here a partner report personal costs from a third party. So when you're really talking here about third parties, it depends absolutely on what type of third party and what is this third party doing. If this third party is actually working on doing an action task described in Annex 1, it should be either a linked third party or a subcontractor and fulfilling the conditions. If the third party is not doing itself an action task, but only providing staff to the one of the beneficiaries, it can be in-kind contribution, and so may possibly seconded staff. The only doubt that I have with the question is that the third party is providing co-funding. I'm not sure how this intervenes there, but from the point of view of personal costs, you would have to see really if the third party is working on the action or only providing staff. And in any case, just the main thing to remember is you cannot just assume that a beneficiary can declare costs for a third party. This is never the case. They have to make sure that the third party is involved in the proper manner. If it's contributing staff, then this has to be provided in Annex 1. If it's a linked third party, it should be in the grant agreement from the beginning. If it's a subcontract, there should be subcontracting costs foreseen in the budget and ensure compliance with the conditions for subcontracting.
Thank you. And we have another question from Anonymous. Are there any requirements for reporting of personnel costs of third parties providing in-kind contribution against payment, Article 11, and who contributes staff?
So, yeah, or I don't know, Sorin, you want to?
I can give it a try. Thank you, Isabel. So probably the question refers to any other requirements in addition to those foreseen in Article 11, if I understand well, or requirements for reporting. To my knowledge, there are no other additional requirements for reporting personal cost, providing in-kind contribution against payment. For the reporting, and there are requirements for the eligibility and according to the grant agreement. For the reporting, I don't think there is any specific, unless for those that do not work under premises of the beneficiary. This may be indeed a specificity. Thank you.
Thank you, Sorin. Somebody's confused here about the hours work. Doesn't the time allocation correspond to hours really work on the project?
So when we say that you cannot use allocated time, we mean that you cannot use a percentage of time, because this is a sort of an assumption that a person is going to work a certain percentage. And that's why we ask for the real number of hours worked on the project. So that cannot be a percentage.
Thank you. And we have a question from Anna Monchirovic. Is an external financial audit of the project necessary for the beneficiary and partners? Should it be included in the budget?
I understand that this question is referring again to the submission of a certificate on the financial statement. If you fall under this requirement, that means that you, as a beneficiary, has requested above 325,000 euros for certain costs. And then, indeed, to do the CFS, you need to use an external financial auditor. And the costs to have this CFS done can be eligible under the category of other costs for contracts. And these costs can be reported in the final reports.
Thank you. And here we have a lucky person who has two projects, one Horizon 2020, one Horizon Europe. Can they use the same timesheet for a person working in both projects?
So under Horizon 2020, you have these minimum requirements that your time recording system must fulfill. Under Horizon Europe, if you opt for using your time recording system, they also have to be reliable. So presumably, if they fulfill the conditions under Horizon 2020, they will be considered as reliable timesheets under Horizon Europe. I don't know if Sorin, you have other views on that.
No, I think that that's very useful, and maybe also to mention that the Horizon 2020 timesheets will be in hours. The Horizon Europe would be normally expected to be in days, but you can also use hours as well and then convert them in days. So no, I think thank you.
Thank you both. And here a question related to the pandemic. Many employees work from home at this time. without a real registration of the working hours? How can we declare that work from home?
During the pandemic, indeed, there were situations where people had to work from home, whereas there was no usual practice of having telework. And that was something that we accepted exceptionally, that even if it was not a usual practice, telework would be accepted. You still need to register the hours in some manner. And we also made an easier possibility for the signature during this COVID pandemic situations, for the signature of the timesheets, where if they could not be signed monthly because people could not physically or they didn't have signed the timesheets, they didn't have any electronic system in place. Either the signature could be postponed to the moment where it would be possible, or there would be a system where you could by exchange of emails, register and confirm the number of hours worked.
Thank you very much. Which kind of document an SME owner without a salary should provide to show evidence of the number of days worked on an action?
I can try to reply to this one. So the same documentation that is for any employee, meaning timesheets or declaration of exclusive work, it's probably timesheets in the case of a SME. Thank you.
Thank you. What are the consequences in case errors are identified by EU for a beneficiary, for example, during an audit or at the finalization of the project? Is there any penalty?
Yes, just before answering this, I just want to point you to the fact that if you have questions related to COVID, there were quite a few question and answers on COVID situations that were published on the portal. And maybe, I don't know if it would be possible, for instance, to add the link to these question and answers in the page of the event, because that can still be used.
There. There is a link to specific FAQs about the COVID-19 situation.
Ah, super, very good. And then about the cases when you have errors identified during an audit, then the audit is going to make the findings that costs are ineligible and that the costs should be rejected. And then the audit will be transferred to the service in charge of the grant, who will see how to implement the audit. And this implementation of the audit can lead to a recovery of the cost. So then that means that the beneficiary receives a debit note and a pre-information letter in which we explain that their costs to be recovered, with an opportunity to provide comments during a contradictory procedure. And then if there are no arguments that we can take into consideration to prevent the recovery, then it's a debit note and we recover the money.
Thank you, Isabel. There is another question, I think it's also for you. What do you mean you cannot declare time allocation, percentage of the time of the person? What if a person is not fully working actually on the action?
So I think there are two different things here. In any case, the main case is that you use timesheets, and when you use timesheets, we want to see a number of hours. You cannot use a percentage to declare the time that the person really worked on the action. You need to report a number of hours, and the number of hours has to be reported in the timesheet. Then the different situation and the exception to the use of timesheets where you put a number of hours is that if the person is working exclusively on the action, instead of filling timesheets, it can just the beneficiary can just sign a declaration saying that this person worked for this number of months exclusively on the action. And I see that Sorin has raised his hand.
Thank you, Isabel. Indeed, I would add here that in practice, what does it mean not to use time allocation is that when we are doing a financial audit, we are really expecting to have a timesheet in which you will declare the number of hours worked on the action. If you have a percentage, for example, 50%, our expectation is that, okay, this 50% is really represents the reality. In order to show that, you can do it for timesheet. Why? Because percentages could also be used for budgeting purposes, estimations, and so on. So we do expect for the cost is to be actual and incurred, and it's for the personnel cost, but also for the number of hours used for the project, because this is an important element to calculate the personnel cost. So the allocation as such is used, yes, in the financial management in general in companies, but it cannot be considered as such, at least from our rules in Horizon 2020, as being equivalent for timesheet. Thank you.
Thank you, Sorin. At the end of the reporting period, we realized that the hourly cost rate exposed was wrong. How can we correct, and when can we correct this mistake? And the project has not ended yet.
So when there is really an error in the calculation of the personal costs, and you have declared the personal cost with an error, you can, at the next reporting period, make an adjustment where you will declare the right cost for the previous reporting period. However, I just want to draw to your attention that you cannot modify the calculation of your costs, notably when you've used the last closed financial year. You cannot the next year think, now I have the full figures, so I would calculate my cost differently. No, what was declared under the last closed financial year must not be touched, and they must remain declared as they were. And it's only if you really made a mistake, like declaring a salary that was too high or something like that, that you can use this adjustment possibility to make the correction.
Thank you. And in the next question, we have the case of somebody who's working less than the 1720 hours, but they use the 1720 to calculate the hourly rate. What is the impact of that for the timesheet? Should we oblige researchers to work up to 1720 hours?
So this number was fixed across the board, taking into consideration variations across Europe. And so it is indeed the only fixed number. And then considering you have to use it, if you want to use this option for productive hours, then you cannot modify it. And still you can only declare in the number of hours worked in the action, the real hours worked, so that you cannot change. And if this is problematic for you, this is indeed one of the situations why we have created other options for the productive hours, and maybe you can look into the two other options like the individual or standard productive hours. And Sorin, please.
Yes, thank you, Isabel. Just to complement that, we should, in practice, we should put separately the number of productive hours used to calculate the number of hours and the number of hours worked. Of course, the number of hours worked can go until the number of standard productive hours, in this case 1720. If they go above, there is the so-called double ceiling. But the two notions are not exactly, in practice, you should pay attention to the definition, to the terminology. Thank you. Thank you
both. A PI is signing timesheets as supervisor of all persons in the action and validating also her timesheets as own supervisor. Is it okay, or does it need a validation from a higher level?
If the PI in its organization has a supervisor, independently from, the action that we are talking about, but if the PI has a supervisor, then the timesheet should be signed by the supervisor.
Thank you. Do we take into account the bonuses that an employee may take at the end of the year based on the assessment procedures of the company?
I'm not exactly sure what this is referring to. So the bonuses that you have at the end of the year, if you are calculating your hourly rate per year, you will put this bonus in the year where the bonus was accrued in the accounts. And if you are making your calculation of the hourly rate per month, then you have to be careful that presumably the bonus was generated over a longer period than a month. And then you can only put in the personal cost of each month the part that corresponds to the entitlement generated during 1 month. That's why also we say that this way of calculating the hourly rate per month is slightly more complex.
Thank you. And is it possible to include in the hourly rate calculation the overtime work by a person in the previous year or increase payments for work in nights or weekend?
So once you have calculated your hourly rate for a full financial year, you don't come back on it unless there was a mistake. And if you had to use for the first month of a reporting period the figures of the last closed financial year, you also don't come back on them when you come to the end of the ongoing financial year. Having said that, overtime is included in the certain options for the productive hours. So if you have the option of fixed number 1,720 hours, this number does not change. So in a way, overtime is included, but you cannot add anything to it. If you are using the option of individual annual productive hours, overtime is something that you must add to the workable hours. And if you are using the standard annual productive hours, it depends on your usual practice for the productive hours to add overtime and how you add it.
Thank you. And the next question, is it possible, well, they have moved it. Is it possible to calculate cost center age rates, hour rates, I imagine?
Maybe I can reply to this one. In practice, yes, it is. So it's the so-called calculation of average personal cost. In practice, is to calculate 1 hourly rate per cost center, per department, per category of staff, and so on. So yes.
Thank you very much. And we have here a question from a colleague, an officer from DG Connect at the European Commission, Matteo Mascagni. Just for information, we have invited not only external people, coordinators, project participants, national contact points to participate, but also people internally from the Commission if they are interested. So Matteo is asking about the CFS. In case of partial takeover from one legal entity to several legal entities, and in the case of the 325,000 euro cumulative threshold is reached, Matteo was wondering if the CFS needs to be provided by the legal entity taking over, or they have to ask the CFS also to the taken over legal entities.
So this is typically the type of case where we would need the full information, because it's a case-by-case analysis of which partial takeover we are talking about, and which are the new legal entities which are taking over the previous one. So we would need to have the full information that he could provide us internally.
So, you know, Matteo, you can contact internally people. Is additional remuneration bonuses for SMEs personnel allowed? What about the overtime against payment?
So for SME, I understand you're talking about, if it's SME personnel, it's the rules apply like any other personal costs. If you're talking about the owner of the SME, if the owner is receiving a salary, again, it's the same rules as for other personal costs. So if there is additional remuneration, if we're on a project base, we have to see if they fulfill the eligibility that we have explained and also in the questions. But if the SME owner is not receiving a salary, then it has to use the unit cost, and the unit cost is a fixed amount. Well, it's a fixed amount with the country coefficient correction, but the amount cannot be changed. Actually, it's automatically applied during the reporting, and you don't change anything to the amount.
Thank you. And the next
sorry, Manuel, I would just add to the fact that if the question refers to additional remuneration as well. Probably it just the understanding of the horizontal provisions, additional remuneration may also refer only to non-profit legal entities.
Thank you very much, Sorin, and sorry for interrupting you. Can I change in personal the cost of a consultant that I want to involve in the project, but the contract is before the project starting date?
So the fact that the consultant is already working with the beneficiary before the project is not an issue. Then if you want to charge it under personal cost, that's not one of the things that you have to check. You will have to check the conditions under the Article 6282, and notably that the contract is directly between the consultant and the beneficiary, and that the consultant is working in the conditions similar to those of an employee, and that the consultant does not own the results, and that the remuneration of the consultant is similar to those of an employee, but the fact that it starts before, for me, is not an issue.
Thank you. And we have another question. Next question from Janine. Why is there a difference between consultants, natural person company, and natural person consultancy firm company?
So if you want the personal cost of a consultant, which has a one-person company, let's say, to fall under personal costs, you have to ensure that the contract is between the natural person and the beneficiary. If the contract is with the one-person company of the consultants, then it cannot fall under the personal costs for a direct contract between a natural person and the beneficiary.
Thank you. Just to let you know that we have a little bit less than 50 minutes to go now, and we still have quite a lot of questions, so we are trying to go fast with those. A professor works in the projects under separate contract in the university. Can he or she use an hourly rate different than regular rate from the teaching contract?
So I think this is typically a case that should be considered under the perspective of project-based remuneration. You have to see if it fulfills the condition that is the type of project-based remuneration where there is perhaps a different contract for certain activities, different, for example, than teaching. So maybe the professor has a certain hourly rate for teaching and a different contract for other activities. And then, as I explained earlier, and I don't think we should go through the whole thing again, you have to check if with this calculation of two rates and comparing them, if there is additional remuneration, and then if the university is a non-profit entity and there is additional remuneration, it may be added on the top of the calculation of the personal cost and in the limit of 8,000 euros per person per year.
Thank you. And a question about whether it's possible to combine annual and monthly hourly rates. For a project ending in 2022, if we use the 2021 annual rates, we cannot include the 2022 salaries increase.
So indeed, the fact that the last close financial, if you are using a yearly hourly rates calculated once per year, and when you are in this situation where you don't have the numbers for the ongoing financial year and you use the last close financial year, indeed, you cannot take into consideration a salary increase that would happen in the first year of the ongoing financial year. And that's why we offer the possibility to use monthly hourly rates. However, you have to use the same option during a full financial year. So you cannot switch in the middle of the financial year, and then you can switch at the beginning of the next financial year.
Okay, thank you. And the next question is from Ruben. Is it possible to introduce only hours to a task with no economic value?
Well, from the perspective of reporting personal costs, you would only need to report the work done on the action, and we don't associate an economic value to this. The only economic value in the sense is that you need to, when you have the number of hours, you're going to multiply it by an hourly rate where the personal costs are are taken in consideration. But for reporting personal costs, I don't see really the impact of the economic value.
If I may add, I'm not sure the question, maybe it could be specified later, or because it's not very clear what exactly does it mean. From an input perspective, this is a reporting requirement to report number of hours. From an output perspective, in the grant agreement during the implementation regarding the economic value, that's, I think, something else which is not tackled here in this presentation. So this could be clarified. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sorin. Thank you, Isabel. Should the date, on timesheet be within the 2 weeks of the following month or within the same month as the timesheet?
If I may, I think this was already replied by Isabel. It's on a monthly basis. If it's the date of the approval and the signature. Okay.
Thank you. If a project starts on day 2 of a month, can the month be counted as full if day 1 is a Sunday? We had already this question before. Somebody wants to add something else?
I would just add, and then the fact that, of course, in practice, we see this in audits also. Of course, if there is a Sunday or a Saturday and so on, but we are looking at this, of course, the workable days. Except situations where there could be work during weekends as well in laboratories and so on, but this doesn't really have an impact. I mean, it may only have an impact if the Sunday or Saturday is a working day. If not, there shouldn't be an impact on the timesheet. The timesheet normally mirrors the month and the hours worked during the month. So of course, if the person and the technician, for example, in the laboratory has to work on Saturday, then he will put his hours on Saturday. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Is the CFS mandatory for projects with budget reach 325,000? Or do the 325 rule only apply to the direct costs, for the direct costs?
So the CFS becomes mandatory when it's not the budget exactly, it's rather what you request as EU contribution and reimbursement, and then the categories which are concerned when you calculate this threshold of 325,000 euros is that the amount of actual cost and unit cost calculated based on the accounting practices of the beneficiary. So that's the actual cost as well as the average personal costs and the cost for internally invoiced goods and services. So you put together all the reimbursement that you've asked for the actual costs and these unit costs based on usual cost accounting practices. And if the EU contribution requested for these costs, this pool of costs is above 325,000 euros, then you have to provide the CFS and you have to provide it at the end in the final report.
Thank you. And here a natural person consultant need to charge VAT, but the university cannot recover the taxes. So it would look like the cost is higher than other employees. Is that okay?
Maybe I can try to reply to this one. So the cost for a natural person, if it's a direct person, so natural person, there shouldn't be any VAT in the cost, or the cost declared. At least it should be declared without VAT. I don't know if Isabel wants to add anything.
No.
Okay, thank you very much. Do personnel costs have to be associated with a cost center or a last degree account specific for that project?
Sorin, I don't know when you are checking the way the costs are registered in the accounts, is that something that you go to that detail?
You're asking me?
Yeah, so I think this may be linked to the fact that when we are auditing an action, we do try to make the link between the cost declared and the accounting books. This in many beneficiaries, they use project-based, they call it project accounting, meaning that they can link cost to a specific project. So many beneficiaries are doing that, of course, for the traceability of the cost. Obviously, when we have to deal with costs like SAP or other type of system, operating system, IT tool that is used in software, sorry, that is used to calculate the project cost, we usually go to, of course, to link this cost declared on the project to the general accounting. So we do make a link here, during an audit. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can we declare only a part of hours recorded in the timesheets?
Well, we advise that you declare all the hours worked on the project and that you declare also all the eligible costs. But of course, there's no problem from our side if you declare less than what you've worked.
Thank you. Can you give an example for reimbursement?
So I guess this is a very large question. So you calculate your personal costs according to the formulas that we have explained, and then you will put the resulting costs in the financial statement that you need to report at the end of a reporting period. And then following the submission of this financial statement, the Commission will analyze your cost claim and the cost and make a payment in accordance, well, for the eligible costs. And the payment will be made to the coordinator of the action of your consortium, and then the coordinator distributes the payment without unjustified delays to the beneficiaries within the consortium.
Thank you.
I hope this answers.
Thank you very much. Is it possible to sign the timesheet by person annually instead of monthly, but with the detail by month?
So the quick answer is no, the frequency of the signature must be at least monthly.
Thank you. And how do you declare a direct cost for a subcontract? For example, train tickets for a subcontract to attend an activity inherent to Horizon 2020.
So here I understand it's not obvious because we use words in a certain manner, but here the example of a train ticket would not be a subcontract. What we call a subcontract under Horizon 2020 is when you outsource the performance of an action task, a task which is described in the Annex 1 of your grant agreement, to a third party. Now, in the case here where an employee needs to take a train ticket, I understand, for example, to go to a conference, which is part of, and this activity is part of the task of the grant, of the action, then this could fall under travel costs. And travel costs are different from personal costs. They have their own eligibility conditions, which are mainly that the cost must be in line with the usual practice of the beneficiary to declare travel costs, to have personal costs in their accounts, and to allow the way the people travel. For example, if they're in their usual policy, it's only second class, where you can't put first class for the travel under the Horizon 2020 action. And also the cost for travel must fulfill, like any other cost, the general eligibility conditions. These are actually something quite useful to know about, and they're in Article 6.1 of your grant agreement. And amongst these general eligibility conditions, you have the fact that the cost is really incurred by the beneficiary during the duration of the action, and also that the cost must be necessary. So it's really necessary for the implementation of the action. And also that it has to be reasonable and in line with the principles of the economy and efficiency.
Thank you very much. We are entering the last minute already, so let's go with the next question. Is it possible to allocate personal internship funded by FEDER to Horizon 2020 projects? If not, is it possible to associate their hours to tasks?
So the fact of working in association, that's something that's not related to cost, but when it comes to the declaration of costs, if the internship is already funded by EU funds, you have to be very careful that you cannot do double funding, which means declaring costs twice for the same item.
Thank you. What happens when the status of an employee is changing? For instance, stops working as an employee and becomes a consultant.
So if the status of an employee is changing, since the eligibility rules could change as well, for example, from employee to consultant, there may be different eligibility rules. In practice, what we see during audits also is that there are two separate hourly rates calculated for that person. Thank you, for the respective period. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Actually, we have reached now noon. What about the staying 5 more minutes? What do you think, Sorin? What do you think, Isabel? And answering a few more questions. Is that okay with you?
Yes, sure.
Yes.
Okay, just 5 minutes, then a few more questions. Would it be acceptable to keep the same hourly rate for the whole duration of a project if the salary remains approximately the same during the years of the project?
The hourly rate has to be calculated per full financial year. So every year you need to, especially, well, if you're doing the calculation per year, but it has to be yearly or monthly, but it cannot be a longer period than that. And then you have to use the personal costs which are recorded in your accounts for that year. So you cannot simply use the hourly rate of, for example, say 2017. You have to recalculate it for the financial year during which there was the personal costs were incurred.
Thank you. How can you refund a cost of material spent by subcontractors? For example, the subcontractor buys a device used for a work package.
Well, so now we're really talking about a subcontract in the way we understand it under Horizon 2020, when an action task is outsourced to a third party, which is a subcontractor. In the case of subcontract, the beneficiary pays a price to the subcontractor, and the price includes everything. So it should cover all the costs of the subcontractor, and including actually a profit margin. And this is why we have specific conditions for subcontracts that they must be awarded in a manner ensuring best value for money. Just in this question, I would advise that you have to be careful that you're not really doing cascading funding, and it's really the subcontractor that is identified as the third party, which is carrying out the action task, and which is not passing on the task to another subcontractor down the line.
Thank you. And how do you calculate the annual productive hours of a part-time contract? By proportionality?
Yes, absolutely. Notably, for example, if we use this fixed number of annual productive hours, which is 1,720, if the person is working part-time, you will use half of this number as your denominator for the calculation of your hourly rate.
Thank you. And here we have a Cococo in Italy that is based on delivering specific outputs. This conflicts with the payment that must be based on work time. How can we solve this conflict?
So for those who don't know, the Cococo in Italy is one of these contracts which are not employment contracts, and they are this bigger in the other category of a quasi-subordinate work contract. So for this type of contract, you have, for each contract on a case-by-case basis, you have to check whether they fulfill the conditions of the Article 6282 for personal costs in the case of a direct contract between a natural person and a beneficiary. And one of these conditions is actually that the remuneration must be similar to those of an employee, and it must be the remuneration must be based on working time and not on delivering specific outputs. So in the case of these questions, it looks as if this Cococo is not something that could fall in the case of personal costs. And then if it's not personal cost, you have to check if it's maybe a contract under Article 10 of the grant agreement, and where the main conditions for the eligibility of cost under contract is that the contract was awarded in a manner ensuring best value for money and without conflict of interest.
Thank you. And I think we are going now for the last question. Does a maximum time duration apply for a line manager to sign a timesheet of an employee? Should it be done monthly, quarterly, annually?
So it's always the same frequency. It's at least monthly.
Okay, thank you very much. We have many more questions, but I don't think we have time to go through all of them. Actually, you should know that all these questions are tabulated, are analyzed, and they eventually feed the frequent asked questions table that we have published in the Funding and Tenders portal, so they are not lost. I want to remind you that presentations are available on the webpage. At the very top, you have the agenda presentation, both presentations from Isabel and Sorin, and you have links to different documents, including the annotated model grant agreement, specific FAQs about the COVID, etc. The recording will be available immediately after this session in the same page, so you can always watch again part of all or the seminar. We want really to thank you for your participation and hope you can join us for the next one. We are publishing from time to time webinars, and actually we are having a new one on dissemination and exploitation next 5 of October, but that will be for Horizon Europe. All these webinars are published in the Funding and Tenders portal under the news section. So if you go to news, you see there the information about the different webinars we publish, and whether you need to register, agenda, all the information is there. So you are welcome to participate anytime. Thank you very much for your participation, and we wish you a very nice day. And of course, sorry, I want to thank Olivier Margan, Emmanuel Crollen for the technical help, and of course, Isabelle Leroy and Sorin Serban for their availability to answer all the questions and to do the presentations. Thank you all. Have a very nice day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.